Today, we're going to go through and set up auth.js with Next.js 13 in the new app directory using the brand new API routes. We're doing this with a beta version of the auth.js library. Now, auth.js previously was known as Next Auth, and the libraries right now are basically interchangeable. So while I go ahead and install the Next Auth package, if you're looking at this in the future, you might be using the auth.js package by then. The content and everything in this video should remain pretty relevant for a while because we're doing everything so forward-looking. We're using the credential provider for this authentication. So that's going to require a username or email and a password. And we're going to look up the user and validate it against our database. I'm going to be using Postgres, but because we're using Prisma, feel free to use whatever database you want to use. Lastly, once we have authenticated the user, we're going to go through and make sure you know how to look up the session information, even change some of the session information if you need to, as well as protect any routes you have throughout the application. With that, let's get started. I'm going to pick up basically where my Prisma tutorial left off. We already have Prisma installed and configured, and there's a very basic user model we have here. I'm going to be using email as the unique login that we're going to use, but feel free to use username or something else if you're doing this on your own. Also, we're totally in the app directory. So here I've cleaned up most of the code, and there's a very basic page that has no authentication. And the layout is exactly what you would expect for the root layout. All right, let's go ahead and add some authentication. The first thing you need to do is you need to install Next Auth. Now I'm installing a very specific build from a pull request, which is adding in the functionality we need. But this should be added to a beta or stable release sometime soon. Once it's installed, we can jump back to the application and we can make the API route that Next Auth is going to use. Remember, we're doing this totally in the app directory using the brand new API routes. So that's why we have to be on the cutting edge of the package version. The file that we're creating is going to be API in the auth folder with a catch-all Next Auth route. So go ahead and create that. Now this doesn't have to be in the API directory. That's kind of a holdover from before, but it makes the migration from the pages directory very easy. Now we have to fill in the basic setup for this route. I've dropped in some of the code, but it's pretty self-explanatory. We're importing the credential provider, which is what we're going to be using to do the validation. And then we're exporting auth options and making sure it's typed correctly so we can get all the benefits of TypeScript. Here's our credential provider, and it just requires a basic name, which is going to show on the login page, and then what credentials you're kind of looking for. So we have an email, which is a label email, and it has a placeholder and what type the form input should actually be. And then here we have the password that we're accepting as well. And for the authorization, we're simply mocking the authorization for right now. It's very important to iteratively test as you're going, and this will let us say, okay, if we had a user and returned it, what does that look like in terms of a full authentication flow? Here, it's a little different. We create the handler with Next Auth, and then we have to export the handler as a get and post function. Now, this is the same handler because Next Auth, the library, exports one kind of global catch-all route handler, but we have to handle get requests and post requests, and those are the function names in the new app directory. All right, once we have this mocked, we can go ahead and start our dev server, and then jump over to test it and see what we have. So this is going to load up our application, and it's just going to show a blank page to start. Before we go and test the authentication, we have to add an environment variable for Next Auth to work. It requires a secret that it's going to use to encrypt the JWT. Now, you can get away if you're only doing stuff client-side by not setting this in dev mode, but because we're going to be doing a bunch of server-side rendering, we have to set it even in development. Jump over to Visual Studio and create an environment.local file. And you're going to set Next Auth, secret, and this can be anything you want. In production, you're probably going to want to do something like this to get a pretty random string that you can set as the secret. Now, here, we don't need it to be anything special because it's in dev mode. We just need to set something so the JWT is signed consistently. I like to restart the dev server just to make sure we have everything locked in. And then from the blank page, we can go and manually navigate to the route we created, API auth, and then Next Auth has a sign-in handler for this route. Inspect the page so we can see what the network request is doing. And then we'll sign in. So in the network request here, this is the request that we made. And you can see that it was a post request sent to API auth callback credentials. And the result was a 302 found, which meant it redirected us back to the home page. You can see the redirect sent here in the response headers. And this is the cookie that's set as your session token, which is used. And you can go to the application tab and take a look at the cookies that have been set. And here's your session token, which is what Next Auth uses to do the authentication. And then it has a cross-site request forgery token that it holds on to, as well as the callback URL that it saves to know where to redirect you. All right, so we successfully logged in. We went to the login page, we got a 302, we're redirected back, and you can see that we have the values that have been set, which say authentication has finished. But this isn't really useful for two reasons. One, we haven't authenticated against our database. Two, we need to get the session information in order to really do something with it. So let's talk about getting the session data. There are three places you're going to want to get the session data and maybe do something about it. One place is server side in a React server component. Since we're in the app directory, that's where you might need the information. You also might need it server side in any of your API routes. And lastly, you also might want to fetch it client side and do something with it there. And these are three different use cases, and two of them happen on the server, one happens on the client. With the latest version of the library, getting the session information is actually very easy to do on the server. To get your session in a React server component, you're going to use the get server session method. So here, because this is a React server component, which everything in the app directory is by default, you can simply request the session, make sure you await the get server session function, import it, and the options are the same options you use to create your Next Auth setup in the route. Now, this is needed because if you change the session or the JWT functionality, the same method needs to use those same options. So here, it's easiest just to pass through the exact same way you're creating and setting it up to make sure it's always consistent. So just go ahead and import that in, save it, and then here, we'll just do a json.stringify so we can take a look at what's in the session. Jump back to Chrome. And there we go. There's a user object, name Ethan, email test@test.com. And if you look at what exactly we're returning here in our route, authorize credentials, there's an ID, there's my name, and then there's an email, test@test.com. Awesome. So this is how you can get the session information on the server. And it's very similar to do it in an API route. Let's go ahead and do that now. In an API route, we'll just create a new file at the top level. Make sure you name it route.ts. And here we're going to do the same thing. We're going to get the session by calling get server session because this function runs on the server. We're passing through the auth options, and then we're going to just return a JSON response to say if we're authenticated or not. And you can go ahead and do like a console.log get API with the result of the session so you can see it. So in Chrome, an easy way to test this is just to go to /API. And it says authenticated true as a JSON response. And we can look at the terminal to see our console log get API with the session as well. Now this also has an image key that you can use for an avatar or something like that that's default in this JWT. All right, so now you can get the session information server side. But what if you want to get it client side? To get it client side, we have to do a couple of things first. Next Auth expects there to be a session provider that you wrap your application in, and then you use a client side hook to get the session information. Now, what the hook is going to do is it's going to make an HTTP request from the client to the server to get the session information, because the client can't decode the JWT locally. It has to ask the server to do it. So if you're ever working with session information, the first time you make the use session request, there's going to be some latency added as it decodes it and stores it in the provider. Let me show you what I mean. The first thing we're going to have to do is make a new providers file. And this is the Next.js recommendation for using providers that are client side only. Here, we're going to set up the session provider, and we're just going to export this as a wrapper around it and pass through the children. And then in our layout, we can add in the provider here. And now our entire application is wrapped in this client provider. So now we can go ahead and make a new client component. Let's call it user and pretend like this is something you might use to display user information. Export. And we're gonna get the session using the use session hook. And then we'll just do something simple again. By using JSON to see what's going on inside the session. So now we have to use this. Let's go ahead and toss it here. And we'll just differentiate this with a server session and a client session, and we'll remove that. So a server session, this is what it looks like. And then the client one, it looks very similar. There's a name still, there's an email, and then it also has an expires key so you can look up when this JWT will expire. Now, if we refresh, I want you to look to see what the latency is. See that? The server session is immediately available because it loaded when the page loaded. But the client session, it first had to request the server to decode the JWT, get the session information, and then it can display it. So when you're using the client use session hook, the first time you call it in your application, it's going to return undefined or null, and you're gonna have to handle that. We can see this by jumping into our user and just logging what it does. We'll do client session. And then we'll look at the console, clear it, and refresh. And the very first client session call is undefined. And then once it loads, it actually has the information. So this is a big difference between the server side getting the session information and the client side getting the session information. In the app directory, I would recommend always trying to get this information server side because it's so much faster. And then you can pass this information throughout your application. And you can even see the provider for the client side calls to make your application more performant. Awesome. So now you can get the session information. The next big thing here is we have to hook this up with Prisma and actually go ahead and look up the user information in our database. Jumping back into our app, we'll take a quick look at our schema. So we have a model, that's a user. There's an ID, an email, a password, and a name. The password, of course, is going to be salted and hashed. Some people might name this salted password or hashed password, but because we all know security here and you're writing a good application, of course a password is going to be hashed. Never store a password in plain text. So I like to just name it password because it's short and sweet. Next Auth doesn't have the concept of registering a user in it. When you are building your application, the registration part is kind of up to you to implement. This is because for things like magic links and email login or OAuth, there is no registration phase. People just sign up, click the login with Google button, and if they don't have an account, it's just in time provisioned. With credential authentication, we have to create the user in the first place. This would normally happen on some sort of register page, but instead of doing that, we're just gonna seed the database with the test user. As you go through and develop your application, you're gonna find shortcuts like this really helpful to speed up development. Instead of having to register a user every time you spin up your dev environment, just seed the database with one, and then you can always instantly log in. To seed the database, we're gonna look at our seed file. This came from our Prisma starter. And you can see here we have a password that is just pasted in. Now, I forget what this password is because it's already been encrypted. So instead of doing this, let's go ahead and set up the mechanism for encrypting the password because we're gonna need it for decrypting it anyways. To do that, jump over and install bcrypt. Bcrypt is the best library for encrypting and comparing passwords. For some reason, it doesn't come with types yet, so go ahead and add the types as well. And then, instead of using this password, what we're gonna do is we're gonna create a new password, and we're gonna call the hash function from bcrypt. And we're just gonna do test with a number of salter rounds. 12 is a pretty good number. And then instead of passing in this password, we're gonna pass in this one. Make sure we await the result. Now that we have the seeding ready to go, let's go ahead and generate our Prisma client, create a migration if you haven't done one already. And then seed the database. All right. At this point, I like to poke around the database and make sure it's doing exactly what we expect. So here we have our user table with an email, test.test.com, and a password that is correctly hashed. So with the user created in the database, now we can go back to that authorize function and add in the actual authentication code. Let's jump into the API auth route. And instead of mocking this out, we can now properly handle the authentication. The first thing to check is if there are no credentials and they didn't pass in the email or they didn't pass in the password, go ahead and return null. Null tells auth.js that there was a invalid credential sent. Not that there was an error, not that we couldn't connect to the database. You can throw exceptions in that case, but this is specifically the credentials the user provided simply weren't correct. Once we've checked that, we know there's an email and password now. So we can go ahead and look up the user. Await, Prisma, user, and we can use find unique because we know that the email in our database is going to be unique. Now, we've looked up the user, but we may or may not find one. So if we don't have a user, go ahead and return null. By bailing out early in the function call, you don't have to have nested ifs. You can just say, if this isn't the case, then return. If this isn't the case, then return. This keeps your code easy to follow. So now we know we have a user because we found one with the email they put in. Let's go ahead and check the passwords. You can't use the hash function again and do a string comparison. Because bcrypt salts things, you're gonna get a different hash each time. You have to use bcrypt's compare functionality to see if the passwords are the same. So here, const is password valid. We can await the compare function. And the first thing is the user string. So we'll do credentials.password. And the second is the encrypted one. So we'll do user.password. And then, well, if it's not correct, return null. And then lastly, we can actually return the information we're looking to do. So here we have to cast the ID to a string because that's what's expected. So user.id is a number. We'll just cast it to a string. And then we'll also return the email and the name. Save it, and let's go ahead and see if this works. Uh-oh. Well, this is a weird error. This very unhelpful error will pop up time to time when you're doing development in the new app directory. And it's really hard to figure out exactly what's happening. But the trick, the secret of looking at this is in route.ts, we're loading bcrypt. And what Next is trying to do is it's trying to resolve and load the bcrypt module into the browser. Now, that's not what we want at all. Bcrypt should only be used server-side. We're just using it for encrypting and comparing passwords all on the server. But it's trying to load it into the client bundle. So we have to tell Next.js, do not load these things into the bundle. Luckily, there's a way to do that. Jump over to the Next configuration file. And there's a key called server components external packages, also under the experimental flag. And here, add in for good measure the Prisma client and bcrypt. These are two libraries that we do not want added into our client bundle. These should only ever be run on the server. You have to restart your dev server whenever you change the file. And now we can go back here, refresh, and see if it loads. Awesome. We're back in action. Let's go ahead and pretend like we logged out by deleting everything. Refresh the page, and our session should all be null. And now we can log in again. And now, because we're properly authenticating against our database, if we type in something random, testing at hello.com, and try to authenticate, it's going to kick us out. So we know that you can't log in with anything anymore. Let's go ahead and log in with our test.test user, and then double check what our password is, test, and sign in. Boom! Success. Thanks, Chrome. So secure. So here we now have a name that is test user. That was seeded in our database. We have the email, and it's correctly showing up server side and client side. So we've successfully done authentication with Prisma and Postgres. All right, it's getting pretty tiresome running through and having to delete cookies to do all this testing stuff. So we can add a couple of nice little things here to make our authentication smoother. Go ahead and create a new auth.tsx file, and let's make some components that we can use for logging in and logging out. So here we're creating a login button and a logout button, and they're going to use the sign in and sign out functionality of Next Auth. And so in our page, we can simply call this to make our life easier. And now we have a sign in and sign out button. So let's go ahead and test signing out. You might have to restart your dev server if it's not working immediately. And then we can test signing in, test at test. Sweet, fully in business here. The next tricky thing to do, but is sometimes very useful, is being able to store arbitrary keys in the JWT. Now, what you might notice is here in this session, there is no user ID. It's not being passed into the session object. And this can be very frustrating if you want to use the session object to store the primary key of the user object. It's very common to create this session object, and then when you're using it server side, use the primary key to look up other information. For example, what blog posts has this user written? If you can't get the ID back from the user, then you have to look up the user by something else, like an email, and that might not be as performant. It's much nicer just to be able to store the information you want into your session and use it that way. So to add custom keys to our session, what we have to do is we have to modify two of the callbacks in Next Auth. Jump into the code and go back to our auth section. And here, after the providers, there's a callback key that allows you to pass through a couple of different things. The first one we're going to work with is session. And the second one we're going to work with is JWT. These two work in tandem. One handles the creation and management of the JWT, and the other handles the session object that is passed around and used whenever you fetch the session. So you can read the docs to see what parameters are passed in here. For the JWT call, there are two that we care the most about. The first is the token, and then the second is the user. Now, the user parameter is only passed into this function the first time the user logs in. This might be through OAuth, this might be through their credential login. So here, this user token is not always going to be present. It's only going to show up the first time they log in. So we have to check to make sure there is a user object before we use it. And then if there is one, we're going to take some of the properties that we're returning from the user and add them into the JWT. So to make this clear, we're going to do this in a couple of passes. First, we're simply going to log, let's call it JWT callback, and we're going to log the token and the user. And then for the session, this has a session and a token, and we're just going to return the session as is, but we're going to log them here too. Save that, go over to Chrome, and refresh the page. And we'll take a look at the output in our terminal. So here we refresh the page and we got the JWT callback with the token. This has the name, the email, our sub. These are JWT properties, expiration, issued at expiration. And then the user is undefined. And then the session callback was called with the session. This is the exact information you're seeing in your use session hook, for example. And then the token, well, this is the exact same token that's passed in here as it is in here. Okay, so the flow goes, first the JWT callback is called and it passes through the token. And then the session callback is called when you have to get the session and it uses that token. So in order to pass something through, we have to return it from the authorize function, pass it through the JWT function, and then use it in the session. To see this flow, we're going to add a random key to our authorize function when it returns. And it's really going to be random. We're going to name it random key, and the value is, hey, cool, right? So now that we're returning this, we're going to see that it's going to show up on the user property when we log in. So go back to Chrome, go ahead and sign out. And then go ahead and sign in again. And before we log in, we're just going to make sure we're here in our logs. And then we're going to sign in. And when we go and look at the server logs, here's the JWT callback, which is called after we've authorized. And you can see that the user object is present. And when it's present, it has the ID, email, name, and the random key. And then by the time we get to the session callback, none of that information is present anymore. So what we're going to do here is if we have the user, which means they just logged in, we're going to return everything in the token as well as the properties you want to pass through. So we're going to return the user ID because that's useful. And then we'll return the random key, which is user random key. Now, the user here is either a user, adapter, or undefined. And the user object is, well, it extends the default user. It's not our user. So we're going to have to cast it. So const u, user is unknown. And this user, what you should do is make it your Prisma user. But because we added a random key here, I'm just going to cast it as any so you can see how this works. All right, so if we have the user, we're going to pass through a couple of the properties. So now, once again, let's sign out. Let's sign in again. And again, we'll look at the logs here. So now, when that first JWT was called, the JWT callback, there is the user with the random information. And then when the session callback is called, here's the session, but the token now has the ID and the random key assigned to it. So the session callback now has the information we put into the token. So now it's a relatively simple process to, instead of returning the session as is, we're going to pass through the properties. And then the user is going to be everything in session.user. And now we can add in the keys that we want to add in from the token. So the ID and then the random key can be token.random key. And the token here is a JWT token, but it allows you to have whatever properties you want on it. We can remove the old session, and now we can go back to Chrome. And when we load the page, we not only have the name and email, but we also have the ID and any other random information you want to add into your JWT. So this is so awesome now. Not only can you authenticate fully, but you can add arbitrary properties to the JWT that you want to have commonly used throughout the application. Very commonly, you're gonna wanna put the ID into the JWT, but you can also put whatever you want in there. Now remember, it's stored as a cookie, so you have to keep the data small and under the maximum cookie size. Well, you're almost all the way through. The most important thing now is to add protected routes into your application. This might be a page you want protected, it might be an entire section of your application you want protected, or it might be an API route. Let's see how we can protect all of these and the different ways we can do protected routes. The first thing is let's make a route worth protecting. We'll make a new file and we're gonna call it page, but put it into a new directory like the dashboard directory. And here we can just have a very simple dashboard that's gonna be super secret. And if you go over to Chrome and you load the dashboard, well, it's not super secret. Anybody can get to this. You can check that by loading an incognito tab and loading it up. Okay, yeah, cool, not protected. So to protect a page, there are 3 different ways you can do it. You can do a check client side, server side, or you can use middleware. We're gonna run through all 3 of these for the different use cases, but I generally think using middleware is the best way to go. To protect this client side, the first thing we can do is cheat and just make the entire page a client page. This isn't the most recommended way to do it, but it's gonna get the point across. And then you're gonna use the use session hook to load the session. Same as before, but there's an on authenticated option that is going to be called. And it's only called when the user's not logged in. Now remember, the first time this hook is called, there's some latency because it has to decode the JWT server side and get back the resulting session, which means there's going to be a loading state, and that's what the status is for. So if the status equals loading, we're going to return a very simple loading or unauthenticated. Otherwise, we can return the page itself. So here, we'll go ahead and just refresh the page, and it says loading or unauthenticated first, and then once the session loads, it shows us the page. Now, if we log out, then we can go back to our dashboard, and we'll see that this stays there, and the not logged in console.log statement is triggered, which is right here. Here, you'll probably want to do something like redirect the page. All right, so that's client-side protection. But we saw there's a latency involved, and we have to load the session. And because all of the pages are React server components by default, it makes much more sense just to look at the session server side and do something about it there. So let's go ahead and remove all of this and turn it back into a server component. And then we can load the session the same way we were doing before. Make sure the component is marked as async to do this. And then you can simply check if there's not a session, what do you want to do? Because we're awaiting the response here, we know there's either going to be a session or it'll be null if there is no session. Going back to what we said earlier, you probably want to redirect the user to the login page, something like using the redirect in next navigation, and we'll call API auth sign in. Otherwise, we'll show them the page. So now, if we are not logged in and we try to go to the dashboard, instead of loading it at all, it's going to redirect us to the sign-in page. And then once we've signed in, if we try to go back to the dashboard, it will show us the super secret page because we're authenticated. Very similarly, you can do the same thing in an API route. Real quick, we'll hop over to our route. Here, if you don't have a session, you can handle it with a 401, which is the proper way to handle an API error like this. So here, we're going to return a new next response, and the body can either be nothing or you can pass through a nice error. Let's do JSON stringify error unauthorized to be nice. And then the second argument, we're going to pass in the status as a 401. This is how you can return other error codes besides just a 200 OK and also give a nice JSON error for your JSON API. Going back to Chrome, we can quickly test this by loading up the API route. Because it's a GET request, our browser just makes it automatically. We're authenticated, so it works properly. Once we sign out, we can try the API again. And here in our network log, you can see that instead of getting that 200 OK, we're getting a 401 unauthorized with the error unauthorized. So this is the experience you'll want to give people who are using your API, and it's how you can do protected API routes. However, there's a better way to handle checking authentication than on a page-per-page basis, and that's middleware. Next Auth has a middleware plugin built in that allows you to easily see if a page or an entire directory of pages should be protected by authentication. To do that, we have to create a new middleware.ts file at the top level of your Next.js directory. And the simplest way is to export default from Next Auth middleware. And this will add authentication to your entire application. We can test that by going to our home page. And because we're not logged in, it kicked us out to the sign-in page. Once you log in, you're able to go back to the dashboard. Now remember, this page didn't have any authentication to begin with. All that page did was show what the session information was. So just by adding this one line, we protected our entire app. Now, it's most useful to protect a sub part of your application. You might want your home page to be unprotected, login pages to be unprotected, help pages to be unprotected. All of those things are fine. But you normally have a subdirectory, app, or something like it, and you want all of those pages protected by authentication. The easiest way to do that is with middleware configuration. Here, you export an object called config, and the key matcher says, apply this middleware only to the routes that you've set up here. So dashboard is going to cover our dashboard example. So we can now remove all of this code. And here you can set it up so this will protect everything in the app directory and all of its subdirectories as well. So if you want to have an entire section of your application, figure out what the top level should be, and then you can add all subpaths. And you can keep adding more things here too as well. So you can have other path, or you can have help. You can keep adding these things into the middleware to protect whatever parts of the application you want. So now we go back to Chrome. Remember, we disabled the dashboard. There's no more authentication here. So if we go to /dashboard, we're signed in so we can see it. If we go ahead and just fake signing out by deleting our cookies and refresh the page, it's going to kick us out to the login page because your entire application has been protected by middleware. Woo! And there you have it. You have now set up credential authentication end to end with Next.js, Next Auth, Prisma, all in the app directory. We're on the cutting edge here, so you might find a couple bugs, hydration errors, or other things as you're going through it. Reset the dev server, refresh the page, and try again. I think some of the most critical things here are the ability to pass through a user ID and primary key or other arbitrary information through the session token, and also using middleware as the main way to protect your application. If you like this video, check out some of my other guides for how to set up Prisma or other things with Next.js. And until next time, happy coding.